general, it's very important to check everything that you believe.
Some of the newer practitioners,
so much misinformation out there.
It's healthy to question your ideologies.
take people's unverified personal gnosis.
All these different bad habits like
Reasonings with ourselves and going over rationality.
thinking everyone's against you, thinking everyone else is wrong.
Escapism,
Attacking others because they don't agree with you.
where they don't want to deal with like any negativity or any criticism.
The right hand and the left hand path.
And it feels like a personal attack against you.
Any sort of darkness or badness in their
Where
life.
the dichotomy begins.
It's important to open yourself.
Is it really valuable or meaningful?
My name is AIDEN.
GEORGINA.
Chandler.
Welcome to Occultism, the side of salt.
In this episode, we're going to be talking about something a little different. The third eye, chakras, and kind of our more Western interpretation and misinterpretation of these systems. So when you're new to the occult, something that I think gets brought up a lot, and even outside of the occult and in just spiritual spaces or woke or conscious spaces, is this idea of the third eye and why it needs to be open, because we'll have this belief that if you open the third eye, you'll be woke and you'll understand all these really complicated and elaborate things. But in reality, the third eye is a little different than this interpretation, and the third eye is actually quite complicated and nowhere near as cut and dry for this. I actually have a little bit of experience with thinking that you need to open the third eye. When I was new to the occult, I read the Psychonauts Field Manual pretty early on, which now I really don't like that book. I have a lot of issues with it, but a big thing that it promotes is doing third eye meditation. And so, of course, baby practitioner me is going to listen to the book. And so I did it, and I realized that I was opening this like way too fast, and it wasn't really where I was in progression with my studies, and that's not the first thing you need to do. You can make sigils before, quote unquote, opening your third eye, end quote. There's a lot of other things you can do, and this kind of focus on the third eye sort of misses the point of what the third eye is actually about and pushes this weird, like, westernized, altered version of Eastern spirituality.
Before even discussing the third eye or going really into what the third eye is, I think it's important to address the systems that it comes from. Now, there are a few different chakra systems, but the one that we are aware of over here in the West is a 7-chakra system that goes from the root to the sacral chakra to the solar plexus, the heart, the throat, the third eye, and then the crown. It seems to be a very, very common thing to try to skip right to this third eye before even addressing the 5 chakras that come before it or what its purpose is in attaining a relationship with the crown. It's very interesting to see a lot of people just want to go into opening this third eye because primarily in New Age spaces, it's talked about with enhancing your psychic ability or ability to manifest or some mystical powers that's locked within yourself. And that is one of the biggest things that I see with it, right? It's a lot of mystic knowledge. It comes from the third eye, and you need to open it to be like a true mystic or a true witch or a true psychic, and it completely ignores the chakras that come before it, which I've talked to a couple people who are more learned in Eastern spirituality than I am. I'm not afraid to admit that I'm not the most aware person when it comes to Eastern spirituality and philosophies. And they really question this practice because you're essentially trying to put a roof on a house that has no support beams, no foundation, or anything like that. And just trying to skip to like what what I see a lot of people out here in the West do is skip to the part that they think is good and juicy without doing any of the real work. And through these conversations, I've learned that this is a very, very toxic and extremely dangerous thing to do, because it can push you into a sort of psychotic state where you're not sure what is real, what isn't real, or what to even trust in your mundane life.
I think this gets into the general misconceptions of the third eye, which the third eye is so focused on because, like you mentioned, it's allegedly supposed to give you all these psychic powers and all these abilities that you can't work without. However, there's also these really strange methods of opening it that I've seen a lot. Like, I've seen all sorts of different things, from you have to meditate on crystals, you have to take certain essential oils. I've seen it, you can literally just open it by smoking weed. Which really doesn't follow any of the traditional systems of working with chakras.
The New Age movement in general is this very... You know how there's an expression that I've seen kind of derogatorily towards certain Christians called cafeteria Christianity, which I think this concept, while I'm a big believer in syncretism and kind of picking your own practice, is extremely prevalent and to a concerning degree in New Age systems, because the New Age movement kind of picks and chooses a lot, but not like a complete pick and choose. They just kind of take anything exciting. And I think the third eye is an exciting thing. Everyone wants to have like psychic abilities. I mean, a lot of the reasons why we get into spirituality and into esotericism is to essentially like wake up and be woke, right? I use the term woke because I see that a lot in these kind of spaces. And so I think it makes sense that the thing that we're going to go to is the third eye, the psychic visions, to understand what we don't understand, because those are goals of a lot of mystics. These things that are associated with the third eye are things we want. And of course, if we're new to the practice, we're probably not reading like the Llewellyn's Complete Book of Chakras. We're probably on Google reading some blog posts. And most people just want to get started now. So they're going to say, okay, what do I have around and what applies to this? Oh, I have some amethyst laying around. I'll lay down and put amethyst on my forehead and open my third eye. And that's what I'm going to do. And I think it's I get why people do that. I've done similar practices because I just didn't know. And a lot of these metaphysical businesses and shops, not all of them, but quite a few, are trying to capitalize on that. They see that there are people who really want to open this third eye, and they want to do it in a way that's simple and with things they can, and people kind of want to buy enlightenment a lot of the time. And so they're going to say, okay, I'm going to make a thing of third eye crystals. I'm going to make a third eye weed smoking blend. I'm going to make a third eye like bracelet that if you wear it, your third eye is going to be open and you're going to have crazy visions. Like, of course businesses are going to see that need and that market and capitalize off it. And I think that practice has led to even further misconceptions.
Before we get much further into this, we need to define where the 7 chakra system of the West originates. From my research, it seems to originate from one particular 15th century text, which I don't know exactly how to pronounce. But it comes from a 15th century text that was recently translated in 1918, and it's not the original chakra system. There is no real one set chakra system, and there's dozens of different chakra systems that have as little as 3 chakras to as many as 100 plus chakras. This system, the 7 chakra system, was kind of, I guess, imported into the West by John Woodruff's 1918 translation, and and then has further been perverted by various other writers into what has become today. Chakra simply means wheel. It's a energy point in the energy body that is a circling spiral of energy that is usually represented as a lotus. It can be used for all sorts of different things, and it's usually used for connecting with various Hindu deities in Hindu chakra systems. Something that is often misconceived about them is that they are attached to a physical point in the body, which is actually not found at all in the original Sanskrit writings, Sanskrit scriptures. They don't actually correspond to a physical part of the body because they're on the energy body, not the actual physical body.
People also really disconnect chakras from Eastern religions and kind of think of them as a more universal thing when it is a more Eastern practice. They're energetic bodies and astral and whatnot systems in pretty much every spiritual system and every spiritual background. But chakras are just one method and are a method from the East. And I really think in general chakras are extracted from their source religions very heavily and applied to everything, which that's how religions grow. That's not inherently a bad thing. But I think that when you get into chakras and you want to read about chakras and you want to work with them and kind of connect with them in an authentic way, it is important to at least be aware of the source and be aware of the actual history. Because if you just go, okay, well, these are energy points on my body that I put things on and focus on, but you're not reading the original text, I mean, like, you know the concept of you need to learn the rules before you can break them? I think that's very applicable here. Because you don't need to do chakras in the most authentic, perfect, reconstructed way, but knowing their history is important and kind of knowing the difference between a few of these systems. Like, I had no idea there were multiple chakra systems until about a year ago. I assumed it was just the one because I just had never seen anyone bring anything else up. I thought that it was so different from what it actually is and the way that it's applied. And so I think that if you're gonna get into chakras, you're gonna try to open your third eye or whatever, you really should at least take a look at the other systems and take a look at the original text and original traditions just to kind of see what the basis is. And then if you want to go on and change things up and make things more your own or more modern or more Western, you should still know the source and be aware of that. You should still know the source and be aware of that.
I wanted to kind of mention something briefly here as far as getting away from origin sources. It seems that in the modern day, we take a slight... There are ways that media specifically goes about being formed. I'm sure everyone's heard the expression that life imitates art, but most of the time, art is inspired by life. In pop culture today, it is not uncommon to see a reference to like a 7-chakra system or a sort of chakra system that is somewhat representative of the real system that is so heavily found in and celebrated here in the West. One of the first two examples that come to mind are there is an episode of Avatar, The Last Airbender, that goes over chakras, and it does somewhat replicate the 7-chakra system that we have over here, although it has a few different names for the first, like, 2 or 3. And then there is, the all-famous anime Naruto that talks about chakra extensively, but not in the same format or form or structure how you would use them in a spiritual practice. And I think a lot of people are nowadays it's very easy to be influenced by these things, and some way I have a feeling that some might go off to practice a sort of chakral meditation and go into a headspace of like, oh, I'm just like Naruto, or I'm just like Aang. And I think that is somewhat dangerous in of itself, because when you have a practice that is found in spirituality, and you use a like fictitious version of it, and you do find yourself making progress, but you're not sure how to handle it or where to go or how to guide oneself, it becomes a little bit it becomes a little concerning at a certain point, because you're not really sure where to go or what to do, because these methods that are in these shows aren't heavily and extensively written about or covered, aside from trying to go to the origin source. And when you go to the origin source, you would feel a bit fraudulent, because how different the actual performance of like what meditating on a chakra would be, or how you would go about even performing different meditations on these chakras. In New Age spaces, specifically, I see, Georgia mentioned syncretism. I see a lot of, and the placing certain crystals on your body to enhance or unblock and open up these chakras. I think it's very interesting that when you go to a metaphysical shop, it does typically have like a chakra that it aligns with, and to my knowledge, it's a non-material working. So I think it's very ironic almost to see that there is a huge consumer aspect to going in and working with these chakras and trying to be like, oh, I am going to use amethyst to open my third eye, or I'm going to use a combination of obsidian and labradorite and whatever, and meditate on these things in order to enhance something that doesn't really celebrate the material or delves into the material. It's mostly internal, and it's mostly something that you would do without really physical use of anything. AIDEN mentioned a blend of smoking drugs or doing something that is typically not celebrated in ascetic religions like we find in the East. It's just very interesting to see how far you can separate yourself from the origin source over here and just have a complete lack of understanding.
I mean, the thing is, if you had the ability to buy enlightenment by going to a shop and just getting some crystals and not having to spend your entire life doing this stuff, I think we would all say that we wouldn't do that, but in reality, I think a lot of us would. I certainly would. If I could just go to a store and buy like a set of 7 crystals and they would align my chakras and fix my life, and I wouldn't have to spend years and years doing both like shadow work, therapy, actual like mundane improvements in my life on top of all the spiritual work, I mean, I'd do it. I think that it's a common desire to want to Because a lot of the way that people get into these systems is that they think they're going to save their life and fix their life. Because I see all over online people talking about how if there's something wrong in your life, that means your chakras are quote unquote unaligned. And to fix them, you need to align and open your chakras. Which chakra imbalance is a little more complicated than that. As much as I'm not a materialist and very spiritual, like, I can admit that sometimes things in our life go wrong for very non-esoteric reasons. And I think this chakra unbalanced thing can almost get into a spiritual bypass because people think, okay, well, I lost my job because my chakras are unbalanced, so I need to go out, buy some crystals, and then fix my chakras, and then my life will be great again. And that becomes another spiritual bypass. And if you're focusing only on aligning and opening your chakras instead of just thinking about the other mundane solutions to your life, that's kind of a risky board to walk. And I see this a lot. I've had people message me, because I run an Instagram, right? And I get a lot of DMs about people I really don't like that people actually send me these, because I'm not a therapist, but people will send me these really long DMs about their personal problems and how to fix them. And I've had multiple people say things like they lost their girlfriend, they lost their jobs because their chakras are aligned and they don't know how to align them. And I'm like, well, your chakras could be unaligned, but there could be other things happening, and the chakras are not the only way to achieve spiritual growth, because I think this idea that the third eye and that chakras are the be-all, end-all, and the core of everything is really common in these kind of westernized, weird takes on Eastern spirituality. And I think that we should remember that life isn't all about the chakras. There are more things in spirituality, there's more going on. And there's even more than one chakra system. I'm sure if you went to an Eastern spiritual guru in 2 different countries, they would tell you wildly different methods and wildly different things. And going on to your tool point, in the West and in Western occultism, it's a very tool-heavy practice. If you're into, like, say, Solomonic magic or planetary practices or, like, Enochian, like, you don't need all the tools in reality, but there's a big emphasis on tools, and people have these very elaborate setups. And I'm not talking about altars, I'm talking about, like, ritual setups. Like, you have, like, your censer, your wand, your athame, your chalice, your banners, your lamens, and you have these, like, very big setups. And so, of course, these setups are something that's kind of ingrained in the Western occult mindset. And there's a lot less of an emphasis on tools in Eastern spirituality. There's some, but it's not the same level of like ritual tools. They're just less focused on, it's a lot more energetically based. It's got a very different flavor to it. And so I think people see Western spirituality and they see these massive setups and like these $100 circle mats and the banners and the tables of practice and whatnot, and think something similar has to exist in other spiritual cultures. And I think part of that is the reason why we want so many chakra tools, because we're so used to this idea of tools and they're kind of ingrained into our little like Western conscience that they're important. I could be way off. That's kind of my own little theorizing, but I think it's definitely a thing. And I think we need to remember that when we're talking about energy work-based systems and energy-based systems, it's gonna have to deal with energy, and energy typically doesn't require these super crazy over-the-top setups and garb and paraphernalia.
A lot of times I see people kind of, in a way, fetishizing third eye and chakras in general, kind of making them a lot less about spirituality and more about physicality and kind of making them like this fix your life thing, like you were saying. Like, if you just align your chakras, you get everything fixed instantly, and making them very physically anchored, when in actuality they're about spiritual ascent, spiritual enlightenment, lots of detachment from the material plane, that if they were attached to physicality, they wouldn't be, there wouldn't be so much of them, there wouldn't be so much to them that would result in spiritual enlightenment. It would be more about physical gain, like other things in Western esotericism.
I think in general, and this could be a whole episode, I think there's this very exoticized, like, understanding of Eastern spirituality in the West. I think that Eastern spirituality is kind of glamorized and seen as this, I really hate the word exotic, but we're talking about exoticization here, so I'm going to use it, as this kind of exotic, mystical, like, thing that's so far from our standard Western spirituality and our standard, like, Judeo-Christian, Abrahamic upbringing. And I think because it seems so different and it seems so kind of special, and it gets kind of, it's very much something that people in the West see as different and use in a way that it can feel like at times they care less about the individual system or differentiating things. Like, I think I've seen so many people say that they're Buddhist. I think there are many legitimate Western Buddhists. I'm not saying there aren't, but I'm saying that I've noticed a lot of people will say that they're Buddhist because they want to be spiritual without really knowing what Buddhism is about. I've had people tell me that Buddhism has no relation to Hinduism, that they're completely different, which is just factually incorrect. And I think people see, like, Eastern spirituality as just meditation and nothing more than that. They're like, oh, Eastern spirituality is meditation and incense and chakras. And there's a lot more happening. And I think because we have this kind of exotic lens over Eastern spirituality, we at the same time end up reducing it because we go, oh, well, Eastern spirituality isn't about religion. It's spiritual, but not religious. But in reality, there's a lot of, like, religions in the East, and a lot of this stuff connects to proper, like a lot of this stuff connects to religion. And I think people just really look at it as this special thing, and it's good that it gets appreciated. I'm not saying it's bad that it's appreciated, but I'm saying it's this weird kind of, not all the time. Once again, I'm speaking about some examples, but I think Eastern spirituality just can get kind of fetishized.
Mentioned briefly about a lot of people over here in the West that identify as Buddhists, and this idea of fetishizing Eastern spirituality is something that I actually have, like, a lot of discussions about, because there are certain things that it seem to be completely ignored that are big parts of practices over here in the West. For instance, yoga, just yoga, right? Yoga is seen by a lot of people in the West as, like, a healthy way to exercise and stretch the body, but it is actually a spiritual practice. Whenever I took a beginner's yoga class in my community college, which, has all of the credibility in the world, the first thing we actually went over were the 5 hathas, and that was very interesting to me, because before we did anything about talking about stretching or the body or the benefits of yoga or anything, the first thing we talked about was lifestyle. And that seems to be a huge thing that I think people like to adapt out of Eastern religions. Well, not adapt out of, but more remove. Um, I have grown up around a lot of friends who are self-identified as stoners, and a lot of them say like, oh, they're Buddhist because they appreciate like a peaceful mindset or like something of that nature, or something of the nature of like, oh, you need to be calm and relaxed and passive and enjoy life. But one of the things about Buddhism is that you're not supposed to use mind-altering substances. So that's like, that's kind of being essentially Buddhist Bible thumping, but it's it's kind of up there, and I'm not really sure how I feel about this idea of like people who are here from the West adapting an Eastern philosophy because they see, the peace in it, the good in it, and all that positive stuff. But then they start kind of trying to exoticize themselves and starting to go after certain aspects of it without really doing any research, without really doing any research or going in depth into where it comes from, the stories that are from Buddha, the stories that talk about you know different aspects of the Buddha's journey. And it's very interesting for me, as someone who was interested in Buddhism for a short while and did like a small amount of studying, not really much outside of simple things like the Eightfold Path, and really just looking at different stories of Buddha's journey. To see someone be like, oh, I'm a Buddhist, and all they do is smoke weed, sit on the ground, and say Om, and like that's what they think Buddhism is. And I'll try to have like a conversation on like Buddhist philosophy with some of these people, and they're like, well, I don't know anything about that. I just know that I'm supposed to live my life and go with the flow. And it seems very much so watered down, and it seems like they're actively trying to make themselves seem either more exotic or more woke or something like that. And when it comes to coming back to the original topic of the third eye, when it comes to the third eye, there's this statement that I've seen over and over and over and over again from the same, not necessarily the same people, but the same type of people, and they're saying, you don't get it, man. You haven't opened your third eye. I'm super aware. Like saying it is being it. And I think that a lot of people over here in the West are guilty of that, of saying that like, if I say I speak, therefore I am, and I am, therefore I'll be. And I think that mindset is kind of really toxic because of this whole idea that you can learn the tiniest bit about something's existence and identify with it straight away without really going into any of the details.
I want to touch on is how I noticed that a lot of Western practitioners also try to syncretize, in a way, the Eastern chakra systems, and try to make them more Western by assigning correspondences to them, like herbs, crystals, sephiroths, archangels, which are not Eastern. They're Christian and Jewish things, the sephiroths and archangels. and trying to almost like westernize them and change them from what they really are, when you can't really make these correspondences. You can't make these correspondences to them easily, because they're 7 of them doesn't mean that they represent the 7 lower not chakras, the 7 lower Sephiroth. They don't represent the 7 planets. They don't represent 7 archangels, because that's not the system that they're from.
So I really enjoy correspondence systems. I have a copy of Liber 77 that sits on my desk at all times, and I have sticky notes in it, and I have like pages and pages of notes on correspondences. I'm into it. And I think that correspondence has a lot of value. And a lot of things are easy to make those connections with and are clear correspondences. And correspondences are obviously a key way to create your microcosm in a ritualistic setting. But when you start bringing in correspondences from systems that are radically different, it can become messy, and it can become a forced correspondence. And then, does that correspondence really hold water if it's so like shoehorned, like you're trying really, really hard to make that connection? And when you make chakra correspondences especially, it gets really complex because there's more than one chakra system, and the chakras are all about the energetic body. So when you start like making like chakra correspondences to tarot cards, it gets a little weird and it gets a little forced. And I think it's great that we are trying to syncretize and make correspondences for Eastern things, such as like the I Ching. Like Crowley bringing the I Ching into our understanding of the tarot was really interesting, and it did throw off some of the other cards, which is why I'm not a huge fan of the Thoth deck personally, but it was very interesting seeing someone trying to pull in those correspondences. But the chakras are hard to correspond because there's so many different systems. And if you're only focusing on the 7 chakra system that's popular in the West, what about people who follow other systems? Or how would that impact chakra practices? So a correspondence is an amazing thing to discover and work on, but we don't need perfect correspondences for everything. Not everything in the entire universe is going to cleanly align. And that's okay. We don't need everything to have the best, most elaborate correspondence system in the world, because some things just aren't going to connect, and that's okay.
One thing that isn't talked about really, because of how wanted this is, the opening of your third eye, or working through your chakras and becoming a balanced individual, is the side effects or even the processes that are necessary in order to even follow through with this act. A very two or three things that I hear about often, people who rush into opening your third eye or doing meditations through your third eye, are things like having horrifying visions, horrifying nightmares, having consistent or frequent headaches, and they feel almost as if they're not necessarily leaving their body or having an outside of body experience, but they feel like they're essentially dissociating. And for someone who like let's say you're the 13-year-old Wiccan getting into spirituality, and the first thing you do is try to get to open your third eye, it can have severe conflicts to you in a more like mental capacity or psychological capacity. You might become more chaotic. You might feel like you're losing yourself. You might feel like you're just becoming completely like insane, and doing this act and not really considering the repercussions and only going into like how it's going to benefit you and how it's going to make you like great with psychic intuition, or have a great sense of others, or have a great sense of spirituality about you. It's kind of ignoring these ideas that in certain spaces there are positive things, but there can also be severe backlashes and severe consequences for doing things wrong. I know I mentioned earlier in the podcast that going straight to opening your third eye is like putting a roof on a house that has no support beams or foundation. And what happens to a roof with no support beams or foundation? It collapses. And that can be a very, very real thing that happens when you look into this and you try to go for it without really building a foundation, or even studying this philosophy and getting a deeper understanding of it before practicing.
Spirituality is dangerous. There are inherent dangers when it comes to playing with your mind, because whether you believe this stuff is external and if you mess up, some crazy demon's going to come and kill your whole family and the Fae are going to kidnap you, or bloody, bloody, blah, or you believe that internally you're more playing with your own psychology, either one of those approaches, there is inherent risk and danger to mystic practice. There are things that can trip you up and can hurt you in either perspective or in between take you have. So with the third eye, I've heard quite a few horror stories from people. I have a friend who's an Eastern practitioner who's way well learned about this beyond me. I'm very Western based, but I have this friend who's an Eastern practitioner, and they were telling me these stories about like people who have opened their third eye prematurely and how their lives have been ruined, and how they were just told by a yoga teacher that they need to open their third eye, and then they kind of started to go insane because they were explaining to me that the third eye, when it's opened, is kind of like going into the deep end and opens you up to these wild things. And if you're not ready to handle that and you haven't done the appropriate like internal working to be able to fully process all that gets open up, it's really dangerous. And I was doing some research, and people were talking about how various like Western yoga teachers were telling them they needed to open their third eye, or various websites were saying it's the critical thing to do, and then they started losing their stability. And no matter to what degree you believe those stories or not, they are out there. And I mean, I've had experiences with the occult that have made me feel kind of crazy. And so if you're brand new and you're opening the floodgates by opening your third eye, I could see that for some people going pretty bad. And so I think if you're gonna do this, you should make sure you're ready. In all of spirituality, being ready is very important. This idea of not being ready is kind of a very common idea in spirituality. And that if you do certain practices before you're ready, things can go poorly. And I think we should remember that and respect that a lot. And it's okay to admit that you're not ready and that you're not at the certain point in your spirituality where you can do these things. Certain things that I'm not ready for spiritually, and I think being aware of where we are and the inherent dangers of spirituality is really important and something that we should pay more mind to.
Overall, there's a lot of misconceptions about chakra systems and how chakras work, but more so with third eye, and in general, all Eastern philosophy has been very westernized, and unless understood from the source material, there's going to be a lot of misconceptions and a lot of misunderstandings that could lead you down very dangerous paths that could lead to, like George was mentioning, a lot of delusions, a lot of general insanity in your life, and just not good things. And I think it's important that we study these original source materials before we go into searching for making our own synchronicities, making our own versions of the systems and trying to alter them before we actually fully understand them. So I think that doing a little bit more research, doing a little bit more reading, and just trying to understand the systems from their origin point is a little bit better than jumping into something based off of a blog post you find online.
Am a firm believer of research before anything, research before practice, and before practice questioning yourself on your research. And I think that if you are willing to jump straight into things, dive right into subjects that you know little to nothing about, you're going to learn that you know little to nothing about them, either the hard way or the harder way. And it's something that I realize is very attractive to a lot of people, and it's something that a lot of people strive for. But you have to realize your position in the grand scheme of things, and realizing where you are versus where you want to be, and assessing whether or not you are willing to take the steps to be where you want to be. Overall, I think that us over here in the West can learn a lot from Eastern philosophies, Eastern spirituality, and Eastern religions. But in order to do so, we have to approach it more in the mindset of, this is an idea that I'm not familiar with, rather than, oh, this is from the East and it's so cool and exotic and different. And I think changing the way we approach it and getting back to material sources instead of rainbow chakras and crystals that are very, very prominent in the New Age movements, will be to the benefit of the whole and the individual.
My final thoughts are that it's really important to know what you're doing before you create your own things or before you kind of break tradition. I think a good place to start is with kind of reading these older texts or reading Eastern sourcing about this. I think that these kind of blog posts and YouTube videos and our podcast, I'm including us in this, it's a good place to begin jumping off into something deeper and should be seen as an entry point to starting a conversation. And so if you feel drawn to these practices, look into them, do some deeper research. And if you do that deeper research and you conclude that using a more Western technique is what works for you and what gets it done, that's amazing. Experiment, make new syncretism. But before you can do that, you should kind of understand the root and where things come from. Because understanding the rules before you break them is a good philosophy in life. And Eastern spirituality is a very complicated thing. It's more than just meditation. I could learn for my entire life and still not have a complete grasp on the intricacies and the beauty and the complexity of Eastern spirituality. It's truly a massive thing, and it's a lot more complicated than meditating and opening your third eye. And while these practices are kind of a good jumping off point, I think we should remember and respect that these traditions are huge and that we shouldn't reduce them down to this love and light mindfulness thing, but respect them for the whole that they are and take them very seriously. Because spirituality has real consequences, whether you believe it's external or internal. That stuff is going to affect you. And paying attention to that is really critical for growth and development. So for this, I want to leave you with just saying, if you want to open your third eye, do research first and make sure that you're ready. And if those line up with what you want to do it. go forth and do it. But just think critically and question things, and never base your spirituality off 1 or 2 blog posts. So, this has been Georgina.
I have been Aiden.
And I'm Chandler.
And you have been listening to Occultism with a Side of Salt.